Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Diet's podcast, Climate and Cuisine, where we discuss the role of food and the impact on our planet. My name is Jane DeMarines, and I'm the executive director of Climate Diet. And I'm excited to have Meghan Jones from Friends of Earth, a powerful ally in this planet saving sphere. Meghan is a food and agriculture expert at Friends of Earth. Specifically, she's a senior policy advocate for school food policy. Meghan, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for being our guest. I'm so impressed with the work your organization has done for many years and your work specifically because we are advocates for getting students just more aware of what they eat and how it impacts the climate. And so I'm eager to hear about the work that you do. So why don't we just start off by, I'd like to ask, and I know that you've become a vegan. Could you tell us a little bit about your origin story and when you became a vegan?
Yeah, absolutely. So I became aware of these issues actually pretty early on. My sixth grade health teacher showed the documentary Food Inc. in my sixth grade health class. And that was the first time that I had ever really thought about where the chicken nuggets that I was eating like 3 or 4 times a week actually came from. And I remember being 10 years old and feeling like, how did I never make this connection before? And I didn't really know any vegetarians or vegans in my life at the time. And went vegetarian at that point, didn't really have like a critical understanding of it or really think about it beyond just like that connection just felt weird to me. It felt weird to me that we were like consuming beings. And so kind of went throughout my life. And then in college, I was a biology major and I was looking for like an easy class to supplement my STEM classes. And my friend suggested this class called En Vogue From Feathers to Leather. And it talked about the ways that animals are commodified in the fashion industry. Wool, silk, down, fur, leather, like all of these different ways. And it talked about the issue really holistically, like not just in terms of animal impacts, but environmental, worker, and my incredible professor, Katie Gillespie, is like the reason that I started thinking about things more critically. I immediately like changed majors actually. I got more involved in political science and studied comparative history of ideas with a focus in critical human and animal studies and started learning about the ways that we really use animals in again, fashion industry, but also food industry, entertainment, science, and medical testing. And that was really what sort of like launched my career and was what inspired me to go vegan in college. And so I've been vegan and plant-based for the last almost 10 years now. It's been going really great, and it's become pretty much like the foundation of what I do, what changes I want to see in the world. And yeah, it's really shaped my worldview and my career. I've worked in the animal advocacy and environmental and climate space since graduating. So it's been a huge part of my life.
Wow, fantastic. That's such a wonderful story. And thank you for making that commitment because it's not easy always being a plant-based eater. I
Mhm.
think we both know it's often, you're out with friends and go to a restaurant. It's nothing. Everyone thinks it's okay if because they go, oh, they'll have a salad. Well,
Yeah,
frankly, we get tired of just eating salads only.
totally.
Thank God there's a lot more restaurants, but thanks for that commitment that you made personally and for being involved in promoting this whole area for the planet as well. We need more people doing that. So I would like to delve into your career a little bit more. And I know you've been working in the policy side um, and the food service industry for schools. Could you explain that a little bit more and what's happening now? I keep hearing about cow's milk not being used and being just thrown away. And so I just really would love to know more about any aspect of that you can share with our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it kind of in a way touches on what you just mentioned, the access to plant-based options, right? Like at restaurants, I think there's a lot of availability, but when we think about students that are wanting to eat plant-based for a variety of reasons, whether it's like religious, cultural, whether it's ethic-based, whether it's in commitment to you know, having a livable future in the climate realm, making sure that those students have access to those types of foods in school cafeterias, I think is just really critical. And it's a core part of the work that we do at Friends of the Earth. Also, with the understanding that school food is such a huge program. I think the statistics are that over 30 million students are served school lunch every single day, which means that our federal government is serving over 5 billion meals every year. And so when we think about the
Wow.
impacts that could be made by like shifting some of those meals to be plant-based in terms of like our carbon footprint, the amount of water that we're using, how we're spending those dollars, like what industries are we propping up, what methods of agriculture are we supporting, with this massive consumer base that isn't just individuals making these decisions, but it's really like it's controlled at the federal level. And so I think that that's what how policy sort of plays a role. School food is heavily regulated and it's very complex. A lot of the regulation happens at the federal level through the National School Lunch Program. So Congress creates laws and then the USDA implements those laws into programs. It gets complicated, but the like TLDR shortened version essentially is that schools receive funding and like rebates from the federal government in order to serve meals at free and reduced cost to students who are in need of those cheaper options. But in response to that, they have to serve meals that are actually like that fit certain guidelines that the USDA has determined in order to be reimbursable. And so, sort of to touch on that cow's milk topic, one of the requirements is that schools have to offer cow's milk with every single reimbursable meal. And access to getting an alternative gets really complex because in order for a student to get an alternative to cow's milk, um, the requirement is that schools only are required to offer a plant-based alternative if the student has a doctor's note that shows that they have a disability that requires them to have an alternative option. Otherwise, the schools can offer non-dairy milk alternatives to students that have a parent's note, but it's not like a student can just walk into a cafeteria at a K through 12 public institution and say, "Hey, I don't drink cow's milk. I'd love a soy milk beverage," and get that. That's not something that schools are authorized to do. So a lot of the policy work that we do at Friends of the Earth is around how do we increase accessibility to these plant-based options? How do we support school districts in offering these plant-based options? And how do we start to actually like chip away at some of those federal regulations and some of those barriers to students having access to those options in schools?
Well, that's fantastic, and it's so needed. And I was glad to hear you bringing up. There's so many groups that really have a problem with dairy,
Mhm.
culturally or religiously, and some people it's just a health issue. I come from an Eastern European heritage, and a lot of my siblings they have issues with cow's milk. So uh, it's just very difficult if that's your only option, frankly. So,
Absolutely.
what do you see, in the future for this? I know that Jamie Raskin, Congressman Raskin, who is my congressman for Maryland, introduced an initiative with a letter to President Biden. He was president that talked about um, trying to get more plant-based foods in general into federal agency cafeterias, and I believe also in the school lunch program. Can you talk a little bit about that? I don't know where it ended up, but just that it was started is great, I think.
Yeah, I think that the idea that there are, federal legislators that are aware of these issues and are pushing for them and are bringing them to, the level of awareness of the rest of Congress, to the White House, to, Americans, I think that's really exciting and very, puts a positive spin on things that like we're starting to talk about these issues because you have to talk about them to be aware of them in order to make those changes happen. I think in terms of the future outlook, we've got a bit of an uphill battle with the state of the administration and the state of Congress. We just saw the USDA repeal, extensive funding for like local and farm to school procurement for school food. So we're dealing with a lot of cuts, and I think that food service directors are having to really go back and look at how can we continue to try to serve healthy meals to students with these cuts to funding. But I also think that there are definitely like positive things on the horizon. One of the primary bills that I'm really responsible for leading the work on at Friends of the Earth is the Healthy Future Students and Earth Act, which will be reintroduced in the summer. And it would be a federal bill that would create a $10 million grant program where school districts could voluntarily apply for the grant and receive funding to help support them in offering more plant-based options. So I think that's a big piece of the puzzle is that, with the National School Lunch Program, these food service directors are really limited both by the regulations that are very strictly controlling the types of foods that can be offered, the quantities of those types of food, but also by the amount of money that they're having to work with. I think that they receive like $3 or $4 from the federal government for each meal. And so, how do you serve healthy, local, organic, plant-based foods when you're working with such a small budget? And so, we really provide technical assistance on the ground to help them figure out how to work within those regulations to actually offer these options. So, I think on the horizon, if that bill passes, that would be an incredible step to the federal government really like pledging to work more on these plant-based initiatives. And I think that we take the approach of like supporting schools that are looking to offer these options, supporting schools that, have these student bases that are asking for more of these options is kind of the best way to go about it. Again, with the state of funding, with all of these looming cuts, with reconciliation, it's yet to be seen how that will play out. But I think that there are promising, things to look at, especially in regards to what you just mentioned. With we're talking about the issues, we're aware, becoming more aware of the link between climate and food and government procurement and how that plays a role in the federal government's climate footprint, right? I think we're starting to address, as we've talked about, like the equity issue of, a large portion of the students that are relying on free and reduced school meals are also the students that are more likely to be lactose intolerant. And so, what does it say that we're giving them a bunch of cow's milk and cheese and heavily dairy filled meals? And so, really looking at this from a holistic standpoint of, how do we support the health of students, the health of our planet, the ease of food service providers that are trying to feed our country's children. How do we really support all of that and show that these things are all linked?
We'll go back a bit in the introduction of this legislation. Who are the co-sponsors for it? Who were the lead sponsors, and then are there co-sponsors for it? Is it very far along?
Yeah, so we haven't introduced it yet. We're currently
Oh,
working on
oh,
getting organizational endorsements. And then Rep. Alma Adams and then Rep. Velasquez have been the two co-sponsors of the bill. So very excited to have their support on that. And yeah, very excited to be raising awareness for it. I help support the work of Plant Powered School Meals Coalition, which is a coalition of nonprofit organizations, food service directors, and individuals that are all working to raise awareness about this. We do movement building. We have a best practices working group that is, there to support school districts that are looking for more support. We've got a state policy working group that helps support anyone working at this similar legislation to, increase plant-based school food at the state level. And then we've also got a federal policy working group that is primarily dedicated to making sure that this bill, goes smoothly, that it passes. And so we're kind of in that phase of, raising awareness about it, sort of building up the momentum before it's reintroduced later this summer.
well, fantastic. That sounds great. Well, I hope you'll update me on it, and maybe we can sign on to some of
Absolutely.
your letters or things that where you want sign-ons.
Absolutely.
So, how much of your work do you get into the climate aspects of it at all? I realize you're working on the policy, but when you are talking about plant-based food, there is a definite benefit to the planet, as you know. So, do you get into that aspect of it at all, or you stick to school lunch? It's about school lunches and making that
No,
healthy
yeah,
and
we definitely bring in
options.
that climate focus. The name of our program is the Climate Friendly School Food Program. So we really do
Oh,
have the framing of it as a way that schools can benefit like their climate footprint. We look at when we do reporting, right? When we look at especially like our program in California, which is our most robust program right now, that's the program that really is offering that like on the ground technical support. We've got peer-to-peer groups where food service directors are coming together to talk about how can we, serve more of those plant-based foods. And then we look at the data and we see, how much has each district saved in terms of water, in terms of carbon emission. And
oh,
it's pretty,
fantastic.
the scale, like I mentioned earlier, it's pretty exciting to see that like even just small swaps, like swapping one burger, one, beef burger out for a plant-based burger, like once a month would have these like immense climate impacts for the better, right? We
Yes,
can save
yes.
so much. And I know on an individual level, we talk about that a lot, right? The amount of water that like you can save as an individual. And so I think when we start getting into like getting to this food service providers and saying, hey, if we just do this, offer an option, have it be one day a week or every single day, making sure that we've got these options, like the amount of impact that we can see from that like scaled type of program, I think is exciting to see. So we definitely have that climate focus. Ours is kind of a focus on like both climate and also addressing health because those are kind of like health is typically the topping point on the policy side of things for the like purpose of these programs, but we definitely work with schools on climate messaging as well.
Well, I'm glad to hear you bring up talking about even cutting out one meal or one burger can make such a big difference. We did a calculation of one year, I think, related to New Year's resolutions and getting people to think about what could I do, to in my New Year's resolutions. And we said, well, if the whole country just gave up meat for one day a week for one year, it was equal to taking 25 million gas-powered cars off the road.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's a massive impact. And people, it just needs more awareness. People don't realize that something small can be something huge if everyone just starts, to do it.
Absolutely.
Um, and we do that with our Meat Down Pledge. We've recently, I mentioned to you, we have been working with schools, and even elementary and middle school students are signing pledges to give up meat for one day a week. Maybe they only do it for a month, but that's a start, and it gets them thinking and creates some awareness that, well, why do we need to kill an animal to get a hamburger? You don't need to.
Absolutely. And I think, we've seen a lot of data to support that like younger generations are really excited and interested in eating plant-based and primarily for climate reasons a lot of the times, and so they're going to their cafeterias and they're expecting to be able to have these options, and then those options don't exist. And so our work is kind of that twofold of how do we address like ensuring that students have these options, ideally every day, ideally not just limited to like a peanut butter and jelly, which is typically, if there are plant-based options in schools being offered, that's typically the only option. And so how do we actually redefine that and start allowing there to be more like robust entree offerings that are exciting to not just the students that are plant-based for ethical or climate reasons, but that are appealing to all of the students so that we sort of, not only can show school districts that they can reduce their emissions and, address that accessibility, but also um, to normalize plant-based food for students. I think the idea that, students could grow up where like they're seeing plant-based options in the cafeteria. So they're being made aware that those options exist. And it's also being normalized as like, it's not this food that's only for people who identify as vegan or vegetarian. It's just a food, it's a meal, right? And so I
Right,
think with them growing
right.
up with that in their cafeteria, it's showing them a different way of eating that I think can be really exciting. And part of our work too really focuses on like the cultural aspect, right? So especially in California, there's a lot of students from different cultural backgrounds that have immigrated to the country. And so if we're serving them, chicken nuggets and pizza and hot dogs and hamburgers, like that might not be as appealing as something like, plant-based tamales or plant-based like tofu, yakisoba or, these other meals that I think like broaden people's food horizons and can be
Yeah, Middle Eastern
nutritious,
food.
delicious. Exactly. Yeah.
Middle Eastern food has so many options, so delicious. In other cultures too. China and Japanese with tofu, served so many different ways, and beans and kimchi, things that are so good for you. Uh, Mexican food and Spanish food with beans. I remember my mother-in-law, we took her to a Mexican restaurant and she'd never had refried beans. And she was eating
Wow.
them and she said, "Oh my God, these are so delicious." And she just was in love with them and never had them. So, getting introduced to new
Yeah.
cultures, cultural foods is a lot of fun too, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we did a report at Friends of the Earth before I was at Friends of the Earth, but in California. And it's like the top entrees being served at most schools are what I said. It's chicken nuggets, it's pizza, and so when we look
Yeah.
at how do we expand that, right? To get more like beans, legumes, lentils. There were recent shifts actually in some of the regulations that made it easier now for schools to serve beans, legumes, and lentils. So we're starting to create resources to help schools be able to do that because I think that the regulations can you know, be a barrier sometimes, right? And so we kind of have that twofold effect of how do we get the regulations to soften up and make it easier for schools to do that? And also how do we support schools in working within the current regulations to still be able to have those meals? Because it's perfectly possible, barring the addition of the cow's milk as the drink, but for the meal itself to be plant-based, even under the current regulations. There's nothing preventing a school from providing a plant-based meal every single day of the week for every single student. That would be in alignment with the guidelines as long as they're meeting those certain categories. So supporting students or schools in actually being able to do that is just that's where we go from that like bottom up technical assistance and support.
That brings up one of the things that people often say to me, and it's like, oh, plant-based food is so expensive. Well, really, it's not. It's a bag of lentils is like $1.19, I think, and
Yeah,
you could probably make meals for 2 to 4 people several times out of that bag. Um,
absolutely.
I love lentils, and they're right at the top of the list of the healthiest, most nutritious proteins out there, and that are so easy to digest. And beans, I make minestrone soup, and it's delicious. And a can of beans is like 99 cents.
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
easy. It's so easy to make and so healthy. I mean, there's just so many dishes that uh, are healthy, but they're not expensive, and they're easy to prepare. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, we
so
did
I
a
don't know.
recent
There's this fiction. I think people think, well, you have to buy maybe some of the plant-based burgers are more expensive than meat. That is true, but that doesn't need to be. And many of them are delicious, and we like them. There's some that are more veggie based that are less expensive, some brands, and I like those as well. But there's all these other dishes that are just easy to make that are just very low cost.
Yeah, we Friends of the Earth did a case study in California, and one of the schools that started offering more plant-based meals actually saved like $42,000 just by
Oh,
reducing meat. So we have found that there actually is a pretty significant cost savings potential for school districts to just reduce meat consumption. And I think something that I think is also important to pay attention to with, there's a reason why meat and dairy is cheaper, right? It's heavily, heavily subsidized by the federal
yes,
government. And this
yes.
actually like plays really big into school food as well, because not only are taxpayer dollars used to subsidize like production, but also like again, like I mentioned, school food, it's a huge program. And so it's a huge consumer base. And so any like excess dairy that isn't sold, the USDA will buy and then will actually give to schools at free and reduced cost, which is why we see a lot of commodities like bulk cheese and, lots of dairy. So, when we look at sort of from a policy perspective, it starts to look interesting when you see like, the USDA is really using this school food program, not just to address like student hunger, but also really to prop up these industries because that's their role, right? The USDA is created in order to support agricultural industry. But when we start to look at like what is the priority? Is it student health or is it, making sure that the dairy industry has a large consumer base and stable markets? We start to see those things starting to be weighed.
I would like to see some of that data, particularly that you mentioned earlier about how much was saved by using plant-based foods
Yeah.
in I guess was it a
It
demonstration
was
program?
Oakland Unified School District, one of those school districts that we work with in California.
Could I get that from you? I'd like to run that in our newsletter. That's
Yeah,
really
absolutely. Yeah,
significant. And
we've
I
got a
have
whole report that talked about the amount of emissions that were saved and water that was saved and cost savings
fantastic.
and
Yeah.
recipes and yeah.
Yeah, people don't realize, let's see, 1 pound of beef, I think, takes 1,800 gallons of water to produce one
Hmm.
pound of beef. I mean, it's massive, the
Yeah.
resource, not to mention how many trees were cut down.
Yeah.
Well, I would just like to ask you if you have any last things you'd like to add. This has been such a great interview and so filled with information that I think our listeners, and certainly I, am new to. And so glad you're here as a guest, and so glad to hear about the work that you are doing.
Yeah, no, I think my last thing is just if you're someone that wants to be involved and you're listening to this, there's a lot of ways to be involved. If you're an individual, if you're a food service worker, if you are affiliated with an organization, we'd love to have you join Plant Powered School Meals Coalition. You can reach out to me via email and I can get you more information on that. Friends of the Earth, if you Google our climate friendly school food program, we've got all of our reports and data and immense resources. So if you're looking for recipes that can be scaled up like at a food service provider level that are like student tested and approved, we've got lots of those. So, and there's a lot of ways I think I would keep a positive outlook. There's ways to get involved both at the district level, at state level, local municipality level, federal level. Like there's a lot of momentum happening toward addressing like what is being served in schools and what is being procured by the government. So I think there's a lot of work being done and exciting opportunities to be involved really however you feel like you can best fit in. So I would stay positive.
Well, that's great. And I hope a lot of people sign up. I think I will. And we'll try to put your email address somewhere on the podcast so that
Great.
people know how to get in touch with you, Megan. So thank you, Megan. And thanks to all of you for listening to our podcast. This has been Jane DeMarines at Climate and Cuisine and Climate Diet. And we've had Meghan Jones from Friends of the Earth doing fantastic work. And we hope you'll come back and talk to us again, Megan.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Signing off. Goodbye, everybody.